So just in case you're wondering what the picture is here on the start slide of each session, that's the Buddha of compassion, in Sanskrit called Avalokiteshvara, and in Tibetan Chenrezig. And Avalokiteshvara Chenrezig has a number of different forms. The one we see here is probably the most common form. It's the four-arm Chenrezig or four-arm Avalokiteshvara. The two hands together in the chest is holding what's called a wish-fulfilling jewel. And that wish-fulfilling jewel is symbolizing this bodhicitta that we briefly mentioned earlier. And in his left hand is a blue opala flower, and that's symbolizing the purity of body, speech, and mind, or the enlightened body, speech, and mind. And in the right hand holding a mala, and that's symbolizing the liberating of sentient beings from samsara. So that's a little commentary on that picture. So let's go to this session 7 now. We'll look at this Tong-len practice, this giving and taking practice. So in this compassion wing of practice, we looked at yesterday and earlier today, the foundation practices, the four immeasurables, the loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, and equanimity. And in that context, we also looked yesterday at how to deal with anger and attachment. And in the last session, we then were building on that basis of the four immeasurables with this exchanging self with others. One of the two main approaches that were commonly used to help us to cultivate this aspiration of bodhicitta. And that's the one we're focusing on here, because this is really directly targeting the selfish, self-centered attitude, which I think is quite prevalent and strong in the modern society. And so this is a very powerful approach, this 5-step method we looked at briefly in the last session on how to overcome that. And in this session, in conjunction with that, we'll be looking at this Tong-len practice. Tong-len is a Tibetan word meaning giving and taking. So let's have a look at the topics we'll be covering in this session. We'll start with meditation, and we'll continue what we left off in the last session. In the last session, we did a meditation of reflecting on the disadvantages of self-cherishing. And following that, the second step in that 5-step process was to reflect on the advantages of cherishing others. And so that's what we'll be doing now in the meditation, having a look at some of the advantages of having that attitude of cherishing others. Then we'll begin with a short review. Then we'll look at the Tong-len, the giving and taking, what it is all about. Then briefly look at the actual practice. We'll do a Tong-len meditation. And again, dispelling a couple of misconceptions that can arise with regard to this practice. And as per normal, finishing with some question answer. So let's begin with the meditation, reflecting on some of the points of the advantages of cherishing others. So if you'd like to find a nice, comfortable posture, let's begin the meditation. As an act of loving kindness for yourself, allow your awareness to descend into the body and simply become aware of sensations throughout the body. And if you notice any areas of tightness or tension in any part of the body, then use the out breath to relax and release that tightness or tension. Softening and relaxing all the muscles in the face. In this way, allowing the entire body to become completely relaxed, completely at ease. Allowing the breathing to settle into its natural rhythm. And setting the mind in a state of ease and relaxation. Simply letting go of any thoughts that may arise. Allowing the mind to come to rest. To rest in the stillness of the present moment. And so let's now reflect on some advantages of cherishing others. And the more that we reflect on these advantages, the easier it becomes for us to open our heart to others and to care for others in a very genuine way. And we can begin by reflecting on your own past experiences. So bring to mind some occasions when you had a genuine attitude of cherishing others, when you had a genuine concern for others' happiness. And see what effect did this have on you and those around you, your family, your friends, work colleagues, and people at large. with an attitude of cherishing others, we won't feel lonely or isolated. We'll feel much more connected with others, much more connected with the world. And by not focusing on each situation from this very narrow perspective of merely how the situation affects us, then we'll feel much more at peace with ourselves. And we won't suffer from the fear, anxiety, craving, frustration, and dissatisfaction that comes from this self-centered attitude. And by seeing each situation from this much broader perspective of how the situation also affects others, we'll begin to cultivate loving kindness and compassion towards others, instead of simply having attachment to friends, apathy to strangers, and hostility, anger, or hatred towards difficult people. And we'll show more consideration and respect for others. And jealousy and arrogance will diminish, will subside. And we won't deliberately harm others in the pursuit of our happiness. And when we develop this attitude that respects and cherishes others, our own lives become most meaningful. What could be more meaningful than striving towards the goal of everybody's happiness and well-being? And with a genuine attitude of cherishing others, our relationships will flourish and harmony in our society will increase. And so, in conclusion, make a strong resolve to exchange, that is, to replace the selfish, self centered attitude, which is the root of all problems and suffering, to exchange or replace that with the attitude of cherishing others, which is the root of all happiness. And then release all appearances and allow the mind to come to rest in that inner purity of the mind, which is in the nature of loving kindness and compassion, a caring for everyone. And we can bring the meditation to a close. Let's begin with a short review before we go on to this topic of Tong-len, of giving and taking. We saw in the sessions yesterday, when we looked at how to deal with anger and attachment, the process of being able to deal with them effectively. And this is a process we can apply to all mental afflictions. And that is, the first step is to understand, to gain a clear understanding here in this case of anger and attachment, but of the mental affliction, to understand what it is and how it leads to suffering. Because sometimes, particularly with mental afflictions such as attachment, it seems like actually it's bringing us happiness. And so if we don't clearly understand how these mental afflictions are actually just causing suffering, then we're not going to have an aspiration to be free of them. Similarly, as we've just been looking here, this selfish, self-centered attitude, that actually superficially it could seem like that this me first attitude is going to bring us happiness. And unfortunately, that's often the message that we receive in the modern world, that in fact that's the case, that you are me first, you're the most important, look after number one. But as we've seen in terms of looking at the disadvantages of self-cherishing, advantages of cherishing others, this me first attitude is just the source of suffering. And so similarly, reflecting on other mental afflictions such as attachment, and we saw that even sometimes we have this misconception that anger can be useful. And so we really need to understand how these mental afflictions how they just lead to suffering, that we really need to eliminate them, to develop the aspiration to be free of them. And as we've briefly seen, and this is something we're going to be looking at in much more detail in the next 2 retreats of Vipassana retreats, to really see how the underlying source of our suffering and also the underlying source of our happiness lies within our own mind. The underlying source of our suffering is our distorted view of reality, which is leading to these mental afflictions. And the underlying source of our happiness is within that mind, when we purify the mind of those mental afflictions. Because without cultivating this view of genuine happiness, we're going to continue to chase after pleasure, thinking that it's somehow going to give us happiness. And we're going to continue to have aversion towards difficult situations, to have hostility, anger, hatred towards difficult people, because they seem to be the source of our suffering. And so then it's going to be very difficult to deal with any mental afflictions, because that distorted view of our worldview is simply feeding the mental afflictions. And then as mental afflictions are arising, the first step we saw that's critical to being able to deal with mental afflictions in the moment is mindfulness. So if we haven't really improved and cultivated mindfulness through the shamatha practice, then I think it's going to be difficult to do anything with mental afflictions at all. Because generally what often happens, particularly if they're very strong mental afflictions, is that we only notice them when they're already taken control of our mind. And then there's not really much we can do to deal with them effectively. But the only thing we can do is to get out of that situation fast before we say and do things we're going to regret. So the key is to be able to effectively deal with mental afflictions as they arise, is to catch them early as they're first arising. To be able to do that, we need mindfulness, to notice them before they have gained power and got control of our mind. And if we can observe them as they're starting to come up, then actually we're free of them and they have no power to harm us, to do anything to us. And so we can simply watch them as they arise and pass. They'll dissipate by themselves. We don't need to fight with them. So that is really the key to dealing with mental afflictions in the moment, the first step, mindfulness. And then in addition to that, we can also then, what we saw is apply these antidotes. And particularly here from the wisdom wing, 2 antidotes that are very effective across the board for pretty well all mental afflictions is impermanence and emptiness. Impermanence is something we're going to look at in more detail and practice that meditation in the next Vipassana retreat, and emptiness in the second Vipassana retreat. With impermanence, now I think we all intellectually accept that everything's changing moment by moment, because that's something that science has proven. We accept that. But here, to be able to use it as an antidote, we need to have more than intellectual understanding. We need to make that experiential. That if we can really begin to experientially see things as changing moment by moment, then we can bring that in the situation of where there's mental affliction, because then we can start to see the whole situation is not static and solid, but it's in this flow and flux changing state. And then you'll find there's not really any basis for the mental affliction to continue, because we're not grasping onto something solid and stable and concrete. We're in that flow. And at a little bit deeper level, the same idea with emptiness, that by coming to have some taste and experience of emptiness, releasing that grasping onto me, the object, the world, then there's no basis for mental afflictions to arise. So these 2 insights can be very, very helpful in dealing with mental afflictions. And we'll look at those in more detail in the 2 upcoming Vipassana retreats. And so we saw here that there are these 3 main areas of practice. On the basis of shamatha, we engage in these 2 wings of practice of wisdom and compassion. And we saw there that at the foundation level, the Theravada level, the wisdom is these 3 marks of existence, and the compassion is the four immeasurables. In the Mahayana, we build on those in terms of emptiness and bodhicitta. Now, it's important that we practice both of these wings of practice. And unfortunately, what often happens is when people come into some sort of spiritual path, they tend to gravitate to one of those two wings and often neglect the other wing. And so we often hear, particularly in Buddhism, that that to overcome mental afflictions and suffering, we need to cultivate wisdom. And so often people naturally gravitate toward that because that's what's said to we need. And so often what happens is people engage in Vipassana practice and sort of forget about the compassion wing of practice. And then we're really not grounded, because if we simply engage in Vipassana practice without the compassion practice, then it's very likely that we can become very self-absorbed, become disconnected, and even insensitive to the sufferings of others. And in very extreme cases, can become completely unethical. That because we think we're some high-level Vipassana practitioner, therefore everything I do is with wisdom, so therefore everything I do is okay, and end up being completely unethical. So we don't really want to go down that path. So we need to make sure that we combine the wisdom with compassion practice. Other people sometimes tend to gravitate more to the compassion wing, who are maybe more naturally kind and compassionate, and put a lot of emphasis in that, and unfortunately sometimes neglect cultivating the wisdom practice. And then, of course, if we do that, then we're not in sync with reality. And then a number of things can happen. Is our compassion can become very biased. We'll help these people over here because they're nice, good people, but these people over here, horrible, nasty people, they don't deserve our compassion. In fact, I hope they suffer. And then also, without cultivating the wisdom, even with the best intention in the world, we can end up doing things which not only don't help, but actually create more suffering. So we can become unskillful in how we help others because of a lack of wisdom. And then we saw earlier that without wisdom, we can end up with what's called compassion burnout, which actually is empathy burnout. But again, it's classic example of a lack of wisdom. And we see this, unfortunately, in people who naturally have a lot of compassion and they want to go out and make a difference in the world. For example, aid workers and social workers, full of enthusiasm, full of compassion, go out and want to make a difference. And then often within 3 to 6 months, they suffer this burnout. And again, that's often a classic example of compassion without wisdom. The wisdom of knowing what we can do to help, knowing what we can't do to help, and the wisdom of knowing when to rest and look after ourselves. And then the other example, which we already looked at earlier, is, and this is something we've all probably experienced many occasions, is we try to help others and then we get taken advantage of us. People take advantage of our good nature and then we suffer. And then we think, well, this compassion doesn't work because I'm just suffering, and we give it up. So remember, compassion always works. What's not working in this situation is a lack of wisdom. Because if we allow people to take advantage of us when we're trying to help them, then that's actually the opposite of compassion. Because in some ways, we're encouraging them to behave badly. Whereas compassion is the aspiration for them to not only overcome suffering, but their mental afflictions as well, the causes of suffering. So therefore, if we add wisdom, then we will not tolerate others' behavior who try to take advantage of us. Not doing cognitive fusion, but we can have compassion for the person, but really not tolerate that negative behavior of trying to take advantage of us. So therefore, it's very important that we practice both wings of practice. Otherwise, we're a little bit unbalanced, because if we only practice one wing, it's a little bit like a bird trying to fly with one wing. It won't get very far. Similarly, if we only practice one of these two wings, we won't move very far along the spiritual path. We're going to have a lot of, actually probably a lot of problems instead arising. And then we are looking here at how we build on these four immeasurables. in particular with this equalizing and exchanging self with others, a very powerful approach, a 5-step process to really help us to have the basis for cultivating this bodhicitta. But even if we're not really cultivating bodhicitta, I think for us in the modern world, these 5 steps here, this 5-step process can be very helpful to really help us to overcome this selfish, self-centered attitude, which is quite strong and prevalent in the modern world. And so let's have a look again at this 5-step process. And so by going through this, exchanging self with others, we'll really be able to transform our attachment and aversion into loving kindness and compassion. So that first step was to equalize self with others, to not put ourselves above others in terms of we're more important in terms of happiness, in wanting happiness. We're all equal in that regard. And then we saw the second step was to reflect on the disadvantages of self-cherishing. And so there we saw some of the disadvantages that come from this me first attitude that I'm the most important. My happiness is the most important. Because if we have this obsessive focus on ourself, then as we saw, we tend to become obsessed about me and my suffering. And out of that often comes a lot of fear, anxiety, stress, and loneliness and so forth. And then often because we become obsessed about me and my happiness, and happiness seems to be coming from out there, we often have a lot of craving, attachment, frustration, dissatisfaction, disappointment, and so forth. And with that exaggerated sense of self-importance, we tend to show a lack of consideration and respect for others. We also leads to a lot of jealousy, competitiveness, and arrogant, dismissive attitude. And then we'll even go to the extent of harming others who stand in the way of our happiness. And then as we saw, we tend to have a very biased attitude towards others. Therefore, it's very difficult to cultivate any genuine loving kindness and compassion to anyone, even to our friends, because we'll really just be caught up in attachment because they seem to be the source of our happiness. And then as we just looked at in the meditation we did now, and we looked at also in the last session, then also to reflect on the advantages of cherishing others, which is really the flip side of the disadvantages of the self-cherishing attitude. And we went through those last session and just in the meditation now. And then we have a very nice quote, very well-known quote, again from that great Indian master Shantideva, on these 2 points of the disadvantages of self-cherishing, advantages of cherishing others. He says, whatever joy there is in the world, all comes from desiring others to be happy. And whatever suffering there is in the world, all comes from desiring myself to be happy. And when he says desiring myself to be happy, he's meaning this selfish, self-centered attitude that sees my happiness as the most important, more important than the happiness of others. And then on the basis of those 2 reflections of reflecting on the disadvantages of selfish attitude, the advantages of attitude of cherishing others, then to make this strong determination to then exchange the selfish mind with the mind of cherishing others. So in daily life, then whenever this selfish mind comes up in daily life, to exchange and replace that as much as we can with the attitude of cherishing others. And as we saw in the earlier session, that if we're going to do a good behavior and we notice that we have a selfish motivation, maybe we're hoping to get something in return or hoping that people think we're someone special because we're doing all these good things, to notice that and reduce that as much as possible, to really exchange that as much as possible with an attitude of cherishing others. But if we still notice there's still some residual selfishness there, then don't let that stop us from doing the good behavior. Because otherwise, at our level, it's very difficult to engage in any virtuous activities of helping others. Because I think at our level, there's always going to be some little level, at least, of selfishness within there. So to be practical, reduce it as much as possible and continue to engage in that virtuous behavior. And then over time, that selfishness will become less and less and less. And then the joy we receive simply from helping others will far outweigh any joy of hoping to get anything in return. And so that leads us now to the fifth point in this process, which is the topic for this session here, is this Tong-len meditation practice, a very powerful meditation practice. Tong-len is a Tibetan word, literally meaning giving and taking. And so what we're doing in this practice, and in fact, we've done the two halves of this practice already in terms of the earlier yesterday, the loving kindness practice and the compassion practice. If we put them together, we actually get the Tong-len practice. And so what we do in Tong-len practice is that we imagine taking on the sufferings of others, and we imagine giving away our happiness to others. And so this is a very powerful method to transform the selfish, self-cherishing attitude. Because the last thing that the selfish, self-cherishing attitude will want to do would be to take on any suffering from anyone. And the last thing that the self-cherishing mind would want to do would be to give away any happiness to anyone. So by imagining doing this, it's really transforming this selfish, self-centered attitude into an attitude of cherishing others. It's really transforming our attachment and aversion into loving kindness and compassion. So let's have a look at how we do this Tong-len practice. As with the earlier loving kindness and compassion practices, it's very much recommended to do this in stages. And again, particularly in our modern world, to start with ourselves first, because if we're not kind and compassionate to ourselves, we won't be able to expand that out to others. So to practice in stages, the Tong-len, first with self, then with friends, then with strangers, then with difficult people, so-called enemies, and then towards all living beings. And generally with this Tong-len practice, we can join it with the breath, as we did a little bit in the loving kindness and compassion. If we can join it with the breath, it really helps us to keep focused. And so what we will be doing, as we did earlier, is that we will be taking the suffering on the in-breath, so that's the compassion part of the practice, and then we'll be giving the happiness on the out-breath, which is the loving kindness part of the practice. Now, as with the earlier practice, we'll be doing visualization in this practice. And with the visualization, there's a couple of ways of visualizing. I'll explain both, and we'll be doing the second one because that's the one we were doing earlier. And I think it's maybe a little bit more appropriate or better for us in the modern world. But actually with this practice, the first approach to visualizing is more the classic way it's taught within Tibetan Buddhism. And that is, again, let's imagine we have a person in front of us that we're doing the Tong-len practice with. And the first part is the compassion part, is taking the suffering. So again, as we did in the compassion practice, we imagine the suffering in the form of black smoke filling their body. Now, in the sort of more classic way this is presented, when we're learning this practice, what we do is on each in-breath, we imagine drawing that black smoke out of their body and imagine that black smoke comes to form a little cloud in front of our face. So we do a number of in-breaths, taking more and more of the black smoke out until eventually all the black smoke is out of the body and it's collected here in front of our face in a small cloud. And then the next step is we then visualize this selfish, self-centered attitude as a small black hard rock in the center of our chest at the level of our heart. And then with one in-breath, we breathe in that black smoke. It comes in, it goes down, it touches the black rock of self-cherishing, and they're both completely destroyed. And the symbolism there is that it is the willingness to take on people's suffering that destroys the selfish, self-cherishing mind. So that's the symbolism of taking the smoke in, touching the rock of self-cherishing, and they're both completely destroyed. Now, I'll explain the second one, which is the one we've already done, and then I'll say why I prefer the second one. The second one is, as we did with the compassion practice, is we visualize the inner purity of our mind as a small radiant sphere of light in the center of our chest. And then as we breathe out the smoke, it comes in and it gets dissolved in that light. And the symbolism there is that that light is the inner purity of mind. It's our inner wisdom. And it's wisdom which destroys mental afflictions and suffering. So that is the symbolism there. And that's what we'll be doing, the approach we'll be doing in this practice. And the reason I prefer to do the second method rather than the more traditional first method is, again, in our modern society, we have this really obsessive focus on the negative. And also, therefore, we do tend to do the cognitive fusion. So then what can happen is when people visualize the rock of selfishness at their heart, they identify with that and they bring the smoke in as a way to somehow punish themselves because they're being so selfish. And then they hold on to that smoke and hold on to that black rock and really feel bad that they're so selfish. So again, that's cognitive fusion. Focus is to identify with that rock of self-cherishing. So rather, I think that particularly in our modern world, it's important to focus on the positive aspects. And the positive aspect here is that no matter how much selfishness or mental afflictions we have in our mind, beneath them is the natural purity of our mind, the inner purity of our mind, our inner wisdom. And therefore, we'll use that. The second half, the loving kindness, is as we did earlier, using the white light at the center of our heart, and then sending out the light of loving kindness. So that is also similar to how it's done traditionally. But the first part, we have these two options, but we'll do the second one. So I just wanted to mention the first one. And if you want to later then experiment with doing that sort of visualization, then you can do that, because that can also be very powerful. But just be wary of not doing that cognitive fusion, wrongly identifying with it and somehow holding on to it. And so we'll go to the actual practice now, and we have 2 slides here describing the stages, so we won't go through them because we've done them already, and they're just there for you for later to know what the steps were. So we'll go therefore right into the meditation now, into the Tong-len practice. And again, we will start with ourself first, and then we'll move out to the next step of doing this Tong-len practice with a friend. So if you'd like to find a nice comfortable posture, let's begin. Setting the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. And relaxing more deeply with each out-breath. The breathing flowing naturally and effortlessly. and allowing the mind to come to rest in the stillness of the present moment. Tong-len is a Tibetan word, literally meaning giving and taking. It's a very powerful method to transform the selfish, self-centered attitude into an attitude of cherishing others, to transform our attachment and aversion into loving kindness and compassion. And we can begin by using the Tong-len practice to cultivate loving kindness and compassion for ourselves first, and then expand out to others. And again, so no matter how much mental afflictions are in our mind, these mental afflictions are not part of the nature of our mind. They're merely like dirt covering the surface of our mind. And beneath these mental afflictions is the natural purity of our mind. So imagine this inner purity of your mind as a small, white, radiant sphere of light in the center of your chest at the level of your heart. And then arouse the thought, how wonderful it would be if I were free of suffering and its causes. May I be free of all suffering and its causes. May I be free of all mental afflictions. And then imagine your mental afflictions and suffering in the form of black smoke filling your body. And with each in-breath, imagine drawing that black smoke into the sphere of light at your heart, completely dissolving it there. So with each in-breath, breathe in with compassion, dissolving and extinguishing your mental afflictions and suffering at your heart, dissolving it into your inner wisdom, inner purity. Imagine the black cloud is now completely extinguished, and now you're completely free of all mental afflictions and suffering. And simply rest in that freedom, rest in that purity of mind. And then arouse the thought, how wonderful it would be if I had happiness and its causes. May I be truly well and happy. And then with each out-breath, imagine rays of light radiating out from the sphere of light at your heart, filling and saturating your entire body and mind, and transforming into everything you need to be happy. So with each out breath, breathe out the light of loving kindness, sending to yourself whatever you need to be happy in the short term and the long term. And then imagine you've now found the genuine happiness that you seek. And simply rest in that state of inner well-being. And just as you wish to be happy and be free of suffering, so does everyone else. So next bring to mind someone close to you, a loved one, who's currently experiencing some sort of physical or mental problem or suffering. And imagine them very clearly in front of you. And arouse the thought, how wonderful it would be if they were free of that problem, free of that suffering. May you be free of all suffering and its causes. And imagining their problem or suffering in the form of black smoke filling their body. And with each in-breath, imagine drawing that black smoke out of their body and bringing it into the sphere of light at your heart, completely dissolving it there. So with each in-breath, breathe in with compassion, dissolving and extinguishing their suffering at your heart. And then imagine the black cloud is now completely extinguished. And now they're completely free of that problem, free of that suffering. And take joy in this. And then arouse the thought, how wonderful it would be if they had happiness in its causes. May you be truly well and happy. And then with each out breath, imagine rays of light radiating out from your heart, filling their body and mind, and transforming into everything they need to be happy. So with each out breath, breathe out the light of loving kindness, sending to them whatever they need to be happy in the short term and the long term. And then imagine they've now found the genuine happiness that they seek, inner well-being, and take delight in this. And then release all appearances and allow the mind to come to rest in that inner purity of mind, which is in the nature of loving kindness and compassion. And so we can bring the meditation to a close. With this practice, a few doubts can come up. One doubt that's quite common is if we're, for example, let's say we're doing this Tong-len practice with someone who has some serious sort of illness, then often people have a little bit of not only doubt, but a lot of fear about doing it because they think, well, if I do this, imagine taking their illness from them, maybe I'll get sick. So will I actually get the sufferings of others when I imagine doing this? And the answer is no, because it's a mental exercise. So we can't actually physically take anyone's illness. But then when that's explained, then people say, well, then what's the point of doing this practice if we can't actually take the suffering of others? The point of the practice is that you are the main beneficiary of the practice. The whole purpose of this practice is to help reduce our selfish, self-centered attitude, increase the attitude of cherishing others, to really transform our attachment and aversion into loving kindness and compassion. But then how does it help others if we're the only one that is really the beneficiary, well, at least direct beneficiary? And that is that this practice will indirectly help others, because if we do this practice, this meditation practice of Tong-len, and we reduce our selfishness, increase our mind of cherishing others, increase our loving kindness and compassion, then it means that when we're out of meditation, we're more likely to help people and to more likely help them in a genuine way. So people now that we help, sometimes we do that with a little bit of a tainted motivation, in terms of sometimes it's like, well, you need to do this. I know what's best for you. So often we have our own little bit of an agenda in helping others. And then by doing this practice, we'll be able to help others more purely without that sort of our own agenda. We'll be helping them for their sake. And then also we'll start to help people who we don't tend to help now, because maybe we don't know them well and I don't really care so much about them. So that's how this practice indirectly helps others, but also it could directly help others. It could have a very subtle, direct, positive impact on the person, due to the interdependent, interconnected nature of reality. And I think maybe there's some scientific support for this, some scientific evidence for this, that particularly if we have a connection with a person and we're doing this practice for this person, even if they're on the other side of the planet, then it is possible, due to the interconnected nature of reality, to have a direct, subtle, positive impact on that person's mind without them even realizing it. And then on that point, one more thing that I'd like to mention is that when we do this practice for others, generally it's best to do it anonymously. Because if we do this practice for others and we tell them we're doing it, one of two things can happen. One is that we do this practice and we tell them, I'm doing this practice for you. You better appreciate that, I'm doing it for you. So it can become a little bit of an ego trip in that way. So as similar to like with generosity, it's often better to do generosity anonymously to avoid it becoming just an ego boost. And so similarly here. And the other reason is, and this is something I heard, which I find quite unfortunate, is that apparently there is some modern studies, and they were doing the study about regarding people praying for other people when they had problems or difficulties. And the study showed actually that if you prayed for others and you told them you prayed for them, actually on average, it had a slight negative impact on the other person. And I find that very tragic. I mean, I didn't see why they said that was the case. Perhaps maybe the person felt like they were under pressure then to get better, or maybe they didn't like or felt uncomfortable for people praying for them. Whatever the reason was, it actually apparently on average had a slight negative impact on the other person if you told them you were praying for them. So therefore here I think certainly it's probably better to, if you're doing it for others, unless you know that by telling them that will help them. Maybe if you told them that you're doing this practice for them, it may help them feel like they're not on their own, that there are people caring for them. If you understand that that may have a positive impact on the person, then yes, you can tell them you're doing this for them. But otherwise, if you start telling everyone that you're doing all these practices for them, again, it may just become a little bit of an ego trip and sort of boost yourself in showing to other people how wonderful you are or so forth. So that's a little bit of dispelling some doubts regarding this practice. So now we have some time for question answer before we take another break. So yes, Roz already put up her hand. So Roz first, and then I think Pamela's second, looks like.
Thanks, Glenn. I had a question around compassion. And sometimes we can kind of be moved to act on the basis of not being able to tolerate the suffering ourselves. So we see something and it's so uncomfortable for us
to act.
And so there's two angles to that. One, in a way, that can be positively helpful because it's a momentum to do something. It's a bit like the thing that I think it was Anna talking about yesterday with anger. It gives you that kind of compulsion. But obviously the downside is it's still about me. And I just wondered, obviously, like there's the emptiness practice, but I just wondered on a general basis, informally, how do you best work with that?
Right. Yeah. Yes, that's right. I mean, if we see someone suffering and it's distressing to us, then if that motivates us to actually help the person, okay, that's better than not helping. But as long as in the process of helping, we're not just sort of getting it out of the way so we don't see it. So we're not, you know, if we're just sort of, oh, that's too distressing for me, get out of here, then that's not really helping anyone, you know. But if that motivates us to help others because we're distressed by it, that's at least that's helping there. But again, I think the key here is, yes, you're right, in terms of it, to overcome that at the deeper level, the wisdom practice of emptiness is really key for that. But also within the compassion wing, I think what we can do is simply shift perspective. Is that not so much that suffering, I don't like that suffering, rather trying to get in the shoes of the person who's experiencing that suffering. How are they seeing that situation from their perspective? And then that can be very helpful then in helping that person for their sake, rather than because I see it as quite distressing, this suffering. So I think that from the compassion side can be very helpful if we shift perspective and try to just be that other person. What is that person experiencing,
And,
rather than what am I experiencing?
and is that linked back to the kind of also making sure you don't project or judge, so you're evaluating rather than projecting? Because there's a danger there, isn't there?
Yeah, of course. I mean, with all of these compassionate activities, we have to bring in wisdom. We have to try and evaluate what the situation is. And also, together with part of that wisdom, is avoid the cognitive fusion. Because otherwise, if we fuse the suffering with them, we may somehow think that they are to blame themselves. We judge them, they're to blame, they're suffering, it's their own fault and all this sort of thing. And then rather than really helping them with compassion, we're just putting them down because we say, well, it was your fault, you're to blame. But that's all cognitive fusion. So if we can simply going to shift the perspective to their perspective, use wisdom, avoid cognitive fusion, then I think you'll find that's really going to be very helpful in terms of effectively helping others with compassion. And at the deepest level, as you mentioned, if we can release the grasping, then that's really going to make that even much more effective.
Thank you, because it's such a visceral thing sometimes, isn't it? So I suppose a lot of it is actually doing the practice formally so that ultimately that stops the visceral, the body reaction.
Exactly. And again, as you mentioned, often it can be that I find that distressing. So another thing you can do is, where's the me that's getting distressed? Where is this me here that seems to be so distressed by that? Try to find that me, because it's the false grasping to me that is causing the distress. If you can do this investigation and see, well, there's no independent me here being distressed, then there can be no basis for distress. But that doesn't mean, of course, if we release the grasping, somehow our mind becomes blank and we don't have empathy. In fact, what it means is if we can release that grasping, we'll be 100% focused on that person with compassion, without the poor me that has to witness this distressing situation.
Thank you.
Yep. Pamela, I think you were sort of indicating you wanted to be next.
Yes, thanks, Glenn.
Sure.
With this Tong-len practice, I find there's a strong affinity between the idea of the white light and one's pure nature and the experience of resting in awareness.
Yeah.
And I have a particular problem with visualizations with
Right.
it. So I was wondering if there's a way I could replace it somehow with resting in awareness and drawing someone's suffering up into that state and it dissipating as a result.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Because if we've done that resting in awareness in a shamatha and we've done a little bit of a passion with it, then all of those things are just appearances, they'll dissolve into that. So yes, you can definitely use that. Definitely.
Right. I'll try that. I think that will work better for me.
Yeah,
Thanks.
yeah. I mean, and of course, at the deepest level, when we go into Dzogchen and Mahamudra, and we're resting in that state, then really it's just an appearance. And so then actually, then it takes on a whole different perspective. But yes, what you've suggested, I think, can be a good thing to do as an alternative.
Right. Thank you.
Okay. I think we might have time for one more question before we take a break, if anyone has a question. No questions? Okay, then let's take a break. So let's take a 30-minute break.